Welcome, TV historians, to this installment of Advanced TV Herstory. And you know, lately we've been doing a lot of deep, dark looks into the past and trying to understand how TV has unfolded the way it has and where all the opportunity has been for women. And sometimes that look to the past is important, but every once in a while, you know what? We almost have to look to the future in order to better understand the past. And the future, with streaming and all of the different ways that we are now receiving our entertainment, really creates a lot of opportunity for women at all aspects of the production realm, and that includes writing. So it hasn't been often that we've really discussed the writing aspect of TV, but today we're going to do that because we have with us Abbe Wright, who is a fancy person in the publishing realm. She's going to tell us about what it is she does in publishing, what she has taken on in the form of a podcast, and then we're going to get down and dirty and talk about some of the best adaptations of literature that we've ever seen on TV and what that leaves for the future, and why this is actually a feminist TV historian kind of topic. So, without going any further than that, welcome Abbe Wright to Advanced TV Herstory.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. I'm so glad to be here.
And I won't even ask how your podcast setup is, but right now mine is filled with cords and microphones and just I am belt and suspenders on this one as a one-person show.
Yes, my laptop is stacked on a pile of cookbooks, so it's we're improvising over here.
So you all know, listeners, it is not a fancy world, this world of podcasting, or at least not those of us who just dwell in the trenches. All right. Abbe Wright dwells in so many trenches, and we're going to hear a little bit about them. If you listen to the Adaptables, which is her podcast, wow, this is like sitting in with a whole bunch of people who really like to talk about literature and then do that compare and contrast of the book and the show and then go on from there. So, Abbe, tell us a little bit about the work that you do, the background, how it has best prepared you to be doing what you're doing today, which I think is really cool.
Well, I am the senior editor of a website called Read It Forward. And Read It Forward is a community of book lovers that helps people find their next great read. So I like to say that I have a total dream job in that I get to help recommend great books to people. And Read It Forward is actually owned by Penguin Random House. And so I sit in the corporate marketing department of Penguin Random House. So I am helping readers find our great books and also helping them connect on that great intersection of pop culture and reading. I think a lot of us sit there in our everyday lives. You know, here's what I'm watching on TV, here are the podcasts I'm listening to, and here's what I'm reading. I think for a lot of us, it's sort of a seamless transition between the three of those things. And so I wanted to sort of examine in my new podcast that intersection where really TV and movies are being made from great books. And so that's how the Adaptables was born. We examine great book-to-screen adaptations, whether that's the big screen or the little screen, and look at, you know, what's different between the book and the show, what got highlighted, where was the drama heightened, how did it get condensed. So it's a really fun conversation, and I know that I love both books and TV and movies, so it was a really natural progression to get to start talking about these things as a job.
So you really are living the dream. Relish it.
I really am, yeah.
And what was your background prior to this opportunity with Penguin and podcasts and things like that?
Well, I actually came up in the world of magazines. So I started at Modern Bride and Elegant Bride as the assistant to the editor-in-chief and really got to see how a magazine runs from both the top and the bottom positions. And then those magazines folded in 2009, the Great Recession, and I actually got a job at the Oprah magazine. I started at in the fashion department and pretty quickly missed writing for magazines and I transitioned within the magazine over to the books department. And I remember the first book party I went to in New York, full of publishing people. I said, oh, these are my people. Okay. I'm not a fashion person. I was an English major. These are my people. So I really fell in love with writing for the Oprah magazine about amazing books that were coming out and helping that readership find their next great read. And after I spent a year at Glamour, and that really helped me figure out, do I want to stay in women's magazines or do I want to go back to books? And I really missed helping people find a great book. So about 5 years ago, I joined the team at Read It Forward, and now I helm that site.
What a great series of opportunities that has led you to a point in your career where you are not only an influencer, but you also understand all of the media intersect. Because it isn't just podcasts, it's podcast and print, and it's books, and it's all of it. And if you could see how many books sometimes I have to read in order to get to a point of even being able to do an interview, and then doing the research in YouTube. It's fascinating. When I realized that you work for Penguin Books, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the classic books that have been brought to the small screen in particular, because that has always been such important appointment viewing for American TV viewers, worldwide. Penguin Books has Penguin Classics. So even when we're talking about some of the very best books that you read when you're assigned in 8th grade or 10th grade, that's you. So you really have an opportunity to make it work for listeners of all ages with your podcast. That sounds cool.
We are very lucky to be able to tap into Penguin Classics. And, when you think about some of the great TV and movies that have been adapted, things like The Outsiders, we are so lucky to have those in our catalog. So, I get all those classics at my fingertips to play with.
The world is your oyster, as it were.
Indeed.
So tell us a little bit about how it is then that the podcast came to be. It sounds like you've been at Penguin now for a couple of years and didn't just get hired to, hey, do a podcast. And then how it is that you think that your podcast is going to evolve as you get more episodes under, in your archives.
Yeah, so I really want to be able to reach readers wherever they are. So we, of course, have written content on readitforward.com. We reach people on social media. We also do YouTube videos where we recommend books in video format. And finally, I said, well, we've got to add a podcast element to this and meet readers where they are and help them find great reads, as they commute or as they cook. So I began my podcast journey at Read It Forward with a podcast that was called Book Club Appetizer. And we actually picked a book every month. We paired an appetizer recipe and a cocktail. We created a Spotify playlist and we wrote book club questions. So the idea was that your book club could essentially use our guidance to help pick a great book club pick. And then you'd have sort of your meeting already prepared for you, complete with background music and food and drink. So that was our first foray into podcasting, and we only did it monthly, and I think people were hungry for, that weekly cadence. So Book Club Appetizer has since transitioned to the Read It Forward podcast, which has just finished our 4th season. And the Read It Forward podcast is all about interviewing great authors about their new books, hearing from them what they're reading, telling people what I'm reading that week. So it's a fun weekly podcast in the cadence of a season. So we've had awesome authors on like Neil Patrick Harris and Deepak Chopra. And I really enjoy getting to talk to authors about their latest work and the books that are on their bedside table. And then finally, I thought, well, where are people hearing about books? A lot of people come to the book after they've seen the TV adaptation. For a lot of people who aren't necessarily voracious readers, they hear something like Little Fires Everywhere on Hulu, and they say, oh, I hear this used to be a book. And so that's how they're coming to the book.
Used to be.
Exactly.
Once upon a time, it was a book.
Right. And so I wanted to meet those people there, and also the people who have read and loved Celeste Ng's novel and are coming to the TV adaptation. So, I think it expands that Venn diagram of people who are coming to the content. So that's sort of my audience, and I hope to just have the audience grow even bigger. I think some people who wouldn't call themselves voracious readers necessarily aren't looking for a quote-unquote bookish podcast, but something that is a TV recap podcast that we've become accustomed to, like, a podcast that recaps the latest season of The Bachelor. That's a format that people already know and love, and I think we can connect with readers that way and get them hooked into reading the book too.
Cool. Excellent. As we think about your experience both in the Read It Forward podcast and the Adaptables, feel free to rely on whichever experience in the trenches you have, and then also just what you recall from growing up, the stuff you saw on TV, which, as it turns out, was an adaptation. Oh, gosh. Listeners, when we talk about TV, we go all the way back to when TV was in its most rudimentary form back in the 40s. Yes, the late 40s, the early 50s. And it was a time of tremendous transition. People were trying to move a radio format over to TV. They were trying to bring the best of, symphonies and plays to TV. And so, and doing so mostly with live presentations. And so if you really are interested in what those early adaptations look like, every once in a while on YouTube, you can go back in and see the various big playhouse. I mean, that was appointment viewing in the 50s. If your family was going to sit down on a Sunday night to watch one thing on TV, usually selected by the parents, it was more likely than not going to be something that was cultural, or else it was bonanza. But don't get me going on that. But the playhouse theaters were the ones that brought, Broadway level theater to the small screen. And so that was really the first opportunity Americans had to see a high quality play that was based on Shakespeare or even the Tennessee Williams, the forms of theater that were the shows that weren't even that old. Then we get to the 70s and 80s, and this is where I'm going to test Abby's knowledge a little bit, but we ended up with just a lot of content landing right there on primetime with the made-for-TV movie, the miniseries, and lo and behold, when you start to go through a list, as I sent Abby, oh my God, isn't this the coolest list? It's amazing how many really significant series are based on adaptations. Abby, did you get a chance to look through some of those lists?
Yes, I mean, it's so fun to see, of course, the ones we know have been adapted from books, but there are so many that have been adapted from books that I actually had kind of forgotten about, or maybe never knew in the first place.
Which ones struck you? I can tell you some of mine where I was like, oh my gosh, yes.
Well, I never knew that Dexter was actually adapted from a novel. And same with Killing Eve is another one that is so in the cultural zeitgeist right now, and I had no idea that it originated with a book.
And Orange is the New Black?
Yes, that I did know, but only because I have read Orange is the New Black. But I went to the book after loving the show.
The ones that struck me, Friday Night Lights, I guess I recall that it had been a book. I think my husband might have read it. But then I started scrolling. I was really curious. It's a list of 50, and I was curious to see what was considered in 1 through 10 as the absolute top ones. And Brideshead Revisited and Roots are considered, I don't know if it was just from sheer popularity and the volume of people watching that these were monumental moments in TV. They weren't necessarily TV history. It's why we haven't spent too much time talking about either one of them. But from an adaptation perspective, wow, it was a game changer.
Yes, I was actually reminding myself about Roots, and it was nominated for 37 Emmys, and it won 9 Emmys. So it really, I think, changed TV when it aired in 1977. It received unprecedented ratings, and still, I think to this day, holds the record as the third highest rated episode for any type of TV series, and was the second most watched overall series finale in US TV history, which blows my mind. I mean, that I think it had the benefit, Roots did, of being, airing in the late 70s when there wasn't such a grab for people's attention. I mean, really, primetime TV was what you had. But I think it's a real testament to both Alex Haley's novel and the incredible adaptation that Roots was that brought it to TV.
And a star-studded cast that in many ways was introduced to American audiences for the first time. So many veterans of stage and film turned out for just monumental. You're right. But I want to jump the track a little bit to Sex and the City, because Candace Bushnell, it was a novel. It got created into a true series. And so we kind of go back and forth with made-for-TV movies like a Christmas Carol, or like any iteration of Shakespeare or any Jane Austen. These have been phenomenal works both in the 60s and 70s, but also recently that have come on as short series or just movies. And then we get actual series like Sex and the City, like Friday Night Lights. How are you going to determine what your future works are going to be that you talk about in the Adaptables?
Well, we have such a wealth to choose from, right? You asked me earlier the adaptations that surprised me that originated from books. But there are so many, of course, that we know in our very fabric come from books. So, of course, Sex and the City became its own entity past the original source material that Candace Bushnell wrote. Things like Big Little Lies, Game of Thrones, The Handmaid's Tale, The Haunting of Hill House, or even Sharp Objects. Those are all ones that I think we know as a culture come from books, and we sort of get to hold up the book as a celebrated source of inspiration. So in terms of where we're headed next, I can share that season 2 of The Adaptables, season 1, of course, covers the adaptation of Hulu's Little Fires Everywhere, but season 2 will cover the Hulu and BBC adaptation of Sally Rooney's Normal People, which, of course, was a beautiful novel that came out last year, and really, I think, over the course of, I believe, 12 episodes, the series will look at the relationship between Marianne and Connell, two young people in Ireland who are from very different sides of the tracks, and yet they fall for one another, they fall in love, they fall out of love, they're best friends, they hate each other. It's source material that is sort of rife for an adaptation because there is so much drama there, and you can really delve deep into character development and take the original work that Sally Rooney wrote and just breathe life into it. As I was talking to Celeste Ng, whose novel Little Fires Everywhere was, of course, adapted this year, she said, the way I think about an adaptation and the way that Liz Tiegler, the show's showrunner, was talking to Celeste about a great adaptation, is that it's very akin to when your favorite song is covered by another band. And you know that the cover is going to bring something new and different. And if it doesn't, it's sort of, why bother? But a great cover sounds different, feels different, but has the same, notes or lyrics. It's drawn from the same inspiration. And so she says, I am thinking of Little Fires Everywhere as it's a great cover song of my original. And I think that's so true. And that way, when we think of it more of a cover song, we can give it permission to be different.
Cool. And very poetic, too.
Yeah, I think so, too.
It's so artistic. So, from a literary world perspective, when you mingle with all of your Penguin colleagues, why do you think there is a resurgence in adaptations of literary works?
I certainly don't work in Hollywood, but I know how expensive it is to invest in the making of something and take the time to create it and find the stars and clear the schedule and get the funding. And so I think Hollywood is really hoping for something that is a proven concept. And so when you take a best-selling novel like Normal People or like Little Fires Everywhere, it already has an audience for the work. It has been proven out in X many copies sold. To be able to adapt something that already has an audience, you sort of are taking that risk and saying, okay, we've got people that we know like this already. Then you can sort of feel a little bit safer about investing millions of dollars in the creation of it. When you have an original idea for a screenplay, you don't know if people are going to gravitate towards it. And I think with a book that has been proven as a bestseller, you know safely, okay, there is an audience for this art.
As you were describing that, which makes a lot of sense, and certainly it is more reassuring, I guess, to think that there are people who want to put their own artistic flair to a work that's already been well received and turn it into a movie or a TV series or a miniseries or whatever, than the idea of rebooting the Rockford Files or Charlie's Angels or whatever it is, because that's already, in many cases, these classics that they're trying to bring back, it just doesn't work for all sorts of reasons. America and the world is in a different headspace than that. Mm-hmm. So I feel like it's really respectful, and it's also, I think, perhaps a greater challenge artistically to then do right by the work that was created in a different medium. I also just happened to think about the fact that for the Adaptables, the podcast, the first two works that you are working with are both from women. Would you say at all that as you see the adaptations that are being done across all the different networks and production houses, and is there a disproportionate number of women-written works?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, that is certainly where my taste level gravitates. I always like to hold up the works of women and present them on whatever stage I am able to as many people as I can personally reach. Certainly when you look at things like Big Little Lies, The Handmaid's Tale, Outlander, Orange is the New Black, Olive Kitteridge, My Brilliant Friend, adapted from the Elena Ferrante novels, there is absolutely a trend of celebrating, adapting, and putting on the main stage words written by women. And a lot of times I am seeing, especially with Reese Witherspoon's production company, Hello Sunshine, her whole raison d'etre, I should say, is to celebrate the works written by women that focus on women's interiority and lives. She is not alone in identifying the power in amplifying women's stories, but she does it in an amazing way. Thankfully, our culture is really turning an important eye to words written by women and things like the Own Voices movement, where finally we are uplifting stories that tell the experience of, people who have been othered up until now. So I'm really loving the trend that I see moving that direction, and I want to help support it and amplify it as best as I can.
Absolutely. And it's a testament to Reese Witherspoon and her leadership in Hollywood as an influencer that she is walking the talk and creating the opportunity not just for the work to be adapted into a different medium or onto a screen, but also that she is bringing in and filling the crews and all of the positions with women. She's become the mentor for this generation, and that's what it's going to take in order for us to have more women telling the story, whether it's behind the camera as a director or in the writing staffs and things like that. So yay, you and I are on the same team on this one. We are on Team Reese.
Totally. And I love that the writer's room for Little Fires Everywhere there was just one man in the room. So
Here's a question for you, since you do collect a check from the publishing industry, and that is, do publishers handle authors differently today, or maybe do their agents represent them differently, with an idea that at some point their work might be adapted, or as an adaptation in discussion when that contract is actually getting signed?
well, it's so interesting. I think, most authors I know, most writers I know are very superstitious, and they would never write their work to be considered for an adaptation. They write their novel the way they see it in their head, the only way they can tell the story. And I think if you were to ask someone sort of finishing a novel, hey, do you think this is going to be adapted for TV? They would say, oh my God, don't say that, don't jinx it. But that is what the role of the agent is for. Agents are the ones who are really responsible for selling the rights for adaptation. Authors typically reserve what's called performance rights, which means that the agent or the author is free to solicit a movie or a TV adaptation without involving the publisher. So it's another separate stream of revenue for their content. And it's the same with merchandise. Traditionally, the work of scouting agents in Hollywood, who are the ones seeking to buy those rights from agents and authors.
All we have to do is think back to every movie we ever watched about the making of Gone with the Wind, where there was some, assistant to David Selznick who had just read this great book by Margaret Mitchell, and oh gosh.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh.
Exactly. But I know a lot of Hollywood producers now, including Reese, especially Reese, are reading a lot more, I think, to maybe find their next project.
Sure. Apart from Reese Witherspoon and her production company, and what we have now seen, as you and I have just rattled off, a dozen different either series or limited series, is there any place that adaptations are more likely to land?
I have seen more projects land recently with streaming outlets. I mean, we've seen, just from the popularity of Tiger King on Netflix recently, that when you have the hot thing to watch, it drives a cultural conversation on Twitter and Facebook. And so I've seen a lot of them land on Hulu and Netflix. Apple TV is doing one called Drowning Jacob, which is coming out soon and has a really all-star cast as well, so they're getting into the mix. But of course, HBO is such a player in this space. It really is the battle of the buzzy. What's going to be the next thing to land that everyone's going to be talking about, and will prompt you to say, oh yeah, I'll watch that, which I think everyone is looking for that content.
Sure. And they have the money to either, purchase it and then commission the work, or that they are just funding it as their own project, whether it's a Netflix project or whatever.
They really do. I think they have the leeway to be a little bit more both aggressive and be able to take risks, because they are not tied to the same restrictions that I think a cable network is.
Yeah. Right now we are living in a time of multiple production models, and even though we are the consumers, we don't necessarily understand how it is that particular series even landed, and who owns it, and who made it possible to begin with. Interesting. In that same thread, we're talking a little bit about your read on the publishing industry and how it is that you're seeing interest in certain titles that are perhaps adaptable, and who's doing the adapting, and how they might intend to adapt it. Would you say that there's a predisposition toward drama or comedy or epics?
I have definitely seen adaptations gravitate more towards a dramatic storyline, right? I think there's so much to parse out in a dramatic storyline. When you take Little Fires Everywhere, for example, there are themes of mother-daughter relationships and how fraught that can be. There are themes of surrogacy and adoption. There are themes of immigration. With the casting of Kerry Washington and really making the character of Mia black, which she is not explicitly black in the novel, that brings a whole thread of racial tension to explore. And so I think dramas are rife with things to dive into, and you can really make an episode around these nuggets of tension that are in the novel. Another thing that Celeste Ng, as I was interviewing her about this process of seeing her work adapted, she said in a novel you can really flash back pretty easily. A character can be thinking in their interior monologue that we as readers are privy to, oh, that school bus just reminded me of my first day of school, and then I'll spend a few pages talking about my first day of school back in 1974. In a series, you really need to lay that drama out for a viewer in a different way. We don't have the interior monologue, and we need to be given things a little bit more clearly. So that's why you'll often get a character saying, well, you remember, honey, back in 1974, my first day of school. Or you'll get the benefit of a flashback episode. And Little Fires Everywhere has some amazing flashbacks that help give us the character's backstory. And without that, we'd sort of be lost as to why their motivations are so strong for doing the things they do. So I think drama is really key. And also I've seen a lot of thrillers be adapted. There's such a fire hydrant of content coming at us at all times. And I think if I can help people parse out what to watch, what to read, what a gift that is that I get to live that. So I feel very lucky.
So you described a little bit your first podcast, which is still going on, Read It Forward. And that's been going on now for
4 seasons. So I think 3 years, 4 seasons.
Wow. And how many episodes in all, roughly?
Around 55.
Nice. You just started the Adaptables in just this year. How is it that with the Adaptables, you chose Little Fires Everywhere to be the first season out of the box?
Well, this book, as I said before, was a huge bestseller. This book didn't go into a paperback printing for a long time because the hardcover was so hot. Everyone was reading this book. Everyone was talking about it. And so I was really excited to see it brought to a new audience and really see how the adaptation, the cover song, if you will, would appear. And this has such a killer cast. It is very rare that you get a TV series with not one, but 2 unbelievable leading actresses. So we have Reese Witherspoon and Kerry Washington, and I was really excited to see how they would appear on screen together, and I have to say they absolutely crackle in scenes together. I'm just talking about it gives me goosebumps because they're unbelievable. So
that's the sign of good TV, when it makes you happy just thinking about it.
Exactly. So between the book and the cast, I thought this is a no-brainer.
It is difficult sometimes to listen to somebody else talk about TV because, if you haven't experienced it, or maybe you haven't seen all of the TV, or you just don't think as deeply as we in podcast creation land do about TV, it can get tough. What's your format of the Adaptables? How do you manage guests? And then how do you integrate your interview with Celeste Ng? Tell us a little bit more about that.
I have a co-host named Emma, and she is my real life work wife, best friend. We already eat lunch together and sit and talk about what we're reading and what we've watched on TV that week. So it felt like a very natural progression to bring our conversations to the airwaves. So Emma and I usually start off each episode by doing a fire count. Little Fires Everywhere is great because it does actually have little fires everywhere. So we start off each episode with a fire count, and we recap that episode's drama. And then we introduce that week's guest. And we've had amazing guests who range from authors to people really involved in the cultural conversation. So in season 1, we had R. Eric Thomas, who's the author of Here For It and also is a senior writer for Elle.com. We had Taylor Jenkins Reid, who is the author of most recently Daisy Jones and the Six, which, of course, is getting adapted for Amazon TV. We've had podcast hosts Grace Atwood and Becca Freeman from the Bad on Paper podcast. We've had Ariana Davis, who's the digital director at the Oprah magazine. And so we really have a lot of people coming in to chime in about what's happened in the episode. And that brings a new, fresh perspective on that week's drama. Every episode, of course, in Little Fires Everywhere, set in the 90s, we talk about our favorite 90s moments, which is so fun.
It sure sounds from the caliber of your guests, then, that there is also a very common language and common level of thinking because you're dealing with people who are writers or work very closely with writers. And so at any point, they kind of move over to their more artistic or creative side to not just talk about Little Fires Everywhere or, any work you do into the future, but they are also looking at it from a very unique perspective.
Yeah, it was really cool. We had my dear friend and author Camille Perry on an episode, and Camille is a queer woman and has written some great queer romance called When Katie Met Cassidy. And of course, the episode she came on to talk about, I had no idea, but one of the main characters is struggling with her own sexuality and coming out. So to have Camille be able to talk about what it was like for her as a young woman in the early 90s grappling with her own sexuality, and to talk about how that was portrayed on the screen, was so unbelievably perfect and something that I didn't even know was going to happen. So we've definitely had some really serendipitous, beautiful moments in terms of our guests and the things that play out in that week's episode.
What is your access to the author, and how do you incorporate that into X number of podcast episodes, which then go into that season, that look at the book and the adaptation?
Yes, so I felt very fortunate to be able to sit down with Celeste Ng and get to talk to her for an hour about her novel, the adaptation, her choice not to be involved in the writing of the screenplay. And so she gave us a real unbelievable insight into what this has been like from her perspective. And so in each episode, our conversation between myself, my co-host, and our guest will gravitate towards something that Celeste and I talked about in our interview. And so then my amazing editor, Clayton, will parse in snippets from the Celeste interview into the episode. We will be running the entire Celeste Ng interview in its entirety the week before we run the finale episode. So that has been very cool to have her perspective on things. I think it's really invaluable and makes us and our podcast, I think, stand out from other recap shows, is that we have the access to the author.
I would say so, absolutely. It really helps. I think it really helps to bring an expert onto a show, or in this case, the actual creator. You just get you get a different perspective. And there are a lot of podcasts out there where it's just people's opinions, and those are really great. But the closer you can get to somebody who is incredibly well versed in a topic, I think that's where people want to spend their time, or at least the listeners that follow Advanced TV Herstory want to hear more than just my opinion. Okay, Abbe Wright, with your publishing hat on, your podcast hat on, and your big TV watcher hat, as well as reader hat. So you've got a life, right? How do you guys work with spoilers? If we were to recommend to folks both the podcasts Read It Forward and the Adaptables, should people be reading the book first? Should they be seeing the show or the movie or the series first?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that. With the Read It Forward podcast, I am very aware that I am often interviewing the author before the book has hit bookstores. often the episodes will air right at the time that the book is coming out. And so I'm very aware that the listener has probably not read the book in question. And so with the Read It Forward podcast, I'm very aware to really not spoil the book for anyone, but really keep it at a place where you could still listen to it without having read the book, and then hopefully it inspires you to want to go and pick up the book. I will say, however, with the Adaptables, we start every episode with the caveat that there are little spoilers everywhere. And we hope that you will, if you haven't already read the book, you don't need to, but we do suggest watching that week's episode or the correlating episode of the show before diving into it, just for some context. Certainly the conversations are great on their own, but we do dive really deeply into the happenings of each episode. And so I think to get the full enjoyment of it, we hope that you will go watch the show, then come back. And, I always am looking for someone after watching a great episode or something, like, who wants to talk about this with me? Who wants to dive into it? And that is the great beauty of a recap podcast.
Some people are sticklers that they want to read the book first, then see the TV show, and then your podcast would be the next, logically in the sequence.
Totally, so. And those people are really my kindred spirits. I'm right there with you.
One other question I guess I'll ask about both podcasts, because, we've piqued people's interest. People normally listen to this, to Advanced TV History, because of their interest in TV and feminism and all the things I talk about. But with your podcast, Read It Forward, which is kind of exclusively about authors and emerging works, do you have an age range in that podcast? Do you have like Read It Forward Junior, where you're working with, young adult fiction or juvenile fiction?
I like to say our Read It Forward listener is anywhere from sort of 21 to 101. And that's a huge span, but I like to think that if you haven't read a book, it's new to you. And there's so much amazing young adult fiction that actually adult readers love. We definitely cover a lot of young adult fiction and teenage protagonists, but there are so many great adult novels that also have teenage protagonists. So we like to have that crossover line very, very blurry. We don't really touch on kids' books, but I actually shouldn't say that, because we had Neil Patrick Harris on talking about his middle grade novels, which are really for middle school age kids, but they're called The Magic Misfits, and I read all 4 and I loved them. So, who's to say what's a book for an adult and what's a book for a teenager? But
so, like those the Neil Patrick Harris interview and reviewing his work, that could be listened to by a middle school class.
Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely.
So language-wise and content-wise, it's all family-friendly.
It is.
Okay. Just checking.
I think so.
And similarly with the Adaptables, then I'm guessing you're just sort of continuing to aim toward adult audiences.
And the Adaptables gets, as any sort of conversation about your favorite media can get heated, we sometimes let an F-bomb fly. We think the conversation is really, and certainly the topics that the show covers, abortion, a woman's right to choose, there are a lot of adult themes, and so we keep the conversation for an adult audience.
Yeah. All right. Excellent. So how do people find your 2 podcasts?
Well, both podcasts are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. And we also have great landing pages on readitforward.com. The Read It Forward podcast is available at readitforward.com/podcasts. And the Adaptables is available at readitforward.com/adaptablespod. And the cool thing about finding them there is we list all of the books that are talked about in each episode with easy buttons to buy them. So if you're like, what was that book they talked about? At Read It Forward, we make it really easy for you to find the books that we discuss in the show.
Yeah, kind of a one-stop shop for
Exactly.
because those conversations, I mean, you can end up referencing a lot of things and writing show notes of, oh yeah, I need to include that and that clip and this book and yeah, I appreciate that. That's good service. Listeners, you've got your marching orders. Head to readitforward.com and dig around and find good stuff and start loading up your own reading and listening queue with that which has sort of been tested and driven by others like Abbe Wright, who has been with us today on Advanced TV History. So Abbe, here you are, you're in the middle of your career, you're making things happen, you're happy, and there is an 18-year-old who's going to go to college and she wants your job. How is she going to start stalking you on social media? What are your media handles?
I am on Twitter at Abbe Wright, and that's ABBEWRIGHT, and I'm on Instagram at Abbe Wright 1, and of course follow Read It Forward on Instagram and Twitter at Read It Forward, and definitely please reach out to me. I love helping people navigate their careers. Ask me what you should read next. I'm your girl, and I love talking to people about books and career. But I'd love to hear from you.
Excellent. All right, and we're going to close out with the question that I often ask guests: what are those 3 TV series from your formative years that helped you sort of see yourself on TV?
Well, I have to start with The Little House on the Prairie. I mean, that is a great adaptation from a great book. It helped me feed my sense of imagination about what if I didn't grow up in a suburb outside of Philadelphia, and what if instead I grew up on the prairie and had to help Ma and Pa. It was that
was your first. That was your first adaptation. You did all that analysis at the age of 8.
Exactly. I also loved, and this is a little embarrassing, but now that you know me and how much I love books, it will make perfect sense, but the show Wishbone, which was on PBS.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
And starred a dog who belonged to a boy named Joe, and whatever was happening in Joe's life was then mirrored in classic literature that Wishbone inhabited. And that really gave me, it introduced me to things like what is Gulliver's Travels and what is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea? What are these books, these classic books? So I think that sparked a curiosity in literature that has never left. And
so I'll just tell you, Wishbone was huge in our household with my now adult children.
Yeah.
We watched Wishbone. We have little Wishbone figurines that I still have. And I mean by little, I mean they're like 1.5 inches tall. I don't know where we got them. They were like a 5-pack or something. And so it's Wishbone in all of these different costumes from the Three Musketeers.
Oh my gosh.
And then we also have a couple Wishbone books, which were really hard to find. Again, I mean, it was just this PBS marketing thing that if they were to bring that back, we would be all over that as a whole family, because it just felt like such a rich production. And then we also had a card game, and it was like the Wishbone card game. I don't know if it was like an Old Maid style or Crazy Eights, but and I know we have it. I know it has survived a couple of moves, and because you don't get rid of anything. Wishbone and Powerpuff Girls in our family, those were gold.
Well, let me just tell you and your listeners that you can find Wishbone in its entirety on YouTube, which is a recent discovery that I have only just made yesterday. And I think that's what I'm going to spend, yes, exactly, my quarantine doing is revisiting Wishbone.
Oh gosh, that was great. Okay, so that's Little House on the Prairie, Wishbone, and then did you have a third?
I think my third is Gossip Girl, which I sort of fell in love with in college, so I was a little bit, I think, maybe beyond the target audience. I also went to private school and then, moved to New York as Gossip Girl was still on the airwaves, and my life was never as dramatic as anything that happened in even the calmest day in the Gossip Girl universe. But I think that's what made it so delicious, is it was a really fun alternate universe to inhabit. And they were so badly behaved, and it just honestly made me feel better about my own actions.
And it prepared you for the corporate world, so...
Exactly.
There you go.
Exactly.
There you go.
There are some Chuck Basses out there in the corporate world, for sure.
Abbe Wright, this has been so much fun speaking with you about your 2 podcasts, all of your reading, all of your writing, and how you're bringing this forward to audiences of all ages and of all interests. Thanks for being on Advanced TV Herstory.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. I had a ball.
A few thoughts to wrap up this episode. Roots? You want to watch Roots? In spring 2020, go look on Amazon Prime or Hulu for the full miniseries. Wishbone? What's the story? Oh my gosh, head over to YouTube. That's what I'm going to do as soon as I send this audio file to Catherine Yang, the amazing editor of Advanced TV Herstory. Thanks so much for your good work, Catherine. Do you like our music? It's Jazzer's Take Me Higher, found on freemusicarchive.com. And for everything else of the TV Herstory flavor, go directly to tvherstory.com, where you'll find social media handles, the chance to sign up for our e-newsletter, or just simply scroll the vault of more than 110 episodes. Because you know what? There's something there for you, I'm certain. Listeners, you're why I podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.